Good morning. I'm Myron Brilliant, the Executive Vice President and Head of International Affairs here at the U.S. Chamber. It's sunny in Washington, D.C., bringing some sunshine, hopefully, to day two of our global forum. We're so pleased that yesterday's robust attendance with over 120 countries represented, and we're looking forward to another day of dynamic programming. Thank you for joining us. Let me just say at the outset today, let me acknowledge Marjorie Chorlins and Scott Eisner from the international team, Sylvia Hall, along with the entire AV and events communications and the entire international division for working so hard to put together this great event today. The Global Forum is really a true whole of chamber undertaking, as Suzanne Clark often says. Yesterday, we really covered a lot of ground, and I hope all of you were able to join us for that session. Highlight a few points here today. Clearly, our world is very interconnected. Some have speculated that globalization is dead because countries are looking inward to strengthen their resiliency to global shocks. But globalization is not dead. Let me just underscore that. It is not dead. It is evolving, it's changing, it's reflecting the times we're in. People, communities, and economies continue to integrate and become intertwined in ways that bring immense benefits. On the flip side, however, there's also means that what happens in one place can profoundly affect countries and companies globally. We've always known this, but we're feeling this heavily with today's tsunami of global challenges. For instance, clearly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought massive unforeseen consequences on the energy, food, and frankly, metals supply chains. This disruption to Ukraine's wheat production is already having huge ramifications around the world, and we will likely start to see an even more devastating outcome as millions of people are struggling to feed their families amidst supply chain challenges. On the energy side, how and when European countries decide to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas will impact energy markets for decades to come. And as we work to address COVID-19, new pandemic challenges continue to pop up, like the lockdowns in Shanghai and other Chinese cities that are exacerbating supply chain disruptions and increasing commodity prices. There is no doubt that we're facing a daunting set of obstacles. But as Ian Bremmer said yesterday, crisis gives us an opportunity to pursue change. It certainly does. There are three significant opportunities for the business community I'd like to briefly touch on today. First, the importance of the United States becoming a leader again on trade. The American economy, 40 million American jobs depend on trade. And as Cargill CEO Dave McClellan underscored yesterday, with a looming food crisis, it's more important than ever before to remove trade barriers. Protectionism will only further stress the global agricultural supply chain. The administration's announcement that the U.S. will lift tariffs on Ukrainian steel is a small step, but we can do much more together. For starters, suspending all tariffs on imports from Ukraine would be more impactful and a powerful symbol of support. Even more important is getting off the sidelines and back into the trade game in a robust way. As our President and CEO, Suzanne Clark, noted yesterday, the United States has not entered into a trade agreement with a new partner in a decade, while the rest of the world is moving forward without us. Europe has 46 trade agreements with 78 countries. We heard from Secretary Raimondo about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is positive progress towards re-engaging Asia, and the United States Chamber supports this initiative. But the incentives for some countries to join are unclear. We're still not providing market access. The business community will continue to work with the U.S. government on this framework to help strengthen trade rules, increase certainty and confidence, and facilitate investment. These issues will be a big focus for the Chamber this week as we host heads of state from the ASEAN countries while they're in D.C. for a summit with President Biden. This is an important summit, an important opportunity, important chance for the United States to demonstrate its commitment to the Asia-Pacific region. Second, we have the opportunity to forge a more sustainable, strategic, frankly, pragmatic relationship with China, the world's second largest economy and a critically important market for American businesses, communities, and consumers. There is rising tension between the United States and China as many of the speakers yesterday noted. But we know that these two large economies impact almost every other global relationship. Companies doing business in Latin America, Asia, and Africa are just as impacted by what is happening in Beijing and Shanghai as companies that are heavily invested in China. We have more work to do in the US-China relationship, and we do need to hold China accountable for its unfair trade practices and its market distortions. But we need to also figure out our relationship going forward with that country. And finally, you have the opportunity to create transparent and smart rules of the road when it comes to the digital economy and emerging technologies. Secretary Raimondo mentioned next week's Trade and Technology Council ministerial meeting in Europe. This is a great opportunity for Europe and the United States to work together on some of the looming challenges before us today. We look forward to taking part in this important forum and exploring these themes later this morning. But our ability to seize these opportunities requires us to strengthen our relationships with our allies and countries worldwide that share our views, share our values, and are here to work together. We explored yesterday during the geostrategic risk panels, geopolitical relationships are not simple as they once were. We need to work on them. As we have often discussed yesterday, let's not overlook the significance of the fact that we're clearly in a multipolar world, and many countries are hedging their bets because their strategic interests are diverse and span the globe. No matter how the United States and Europe feels about the egregious, and let me underscore, egregious, unprovoked behavior of Russia towards Ukraine, or predatory market practices to China, many countries still don't want to pick sides. This reality requires deft U.S. leadership and some agility, not only from our government, but from the private sector. Business leaders around the world and in this country are adapting to the changing landscape. With our global reach, the U.S. Chamber promises to make a commitment to work closely with our government and all of you who are participating here today in responding to the challenges that are being discussed over these days. Because we recognize the role that the U.S. private sector plays in enhancing America's standing around the world. Today, we're going to get deep into conversations on the digital economy, on the climate and sustainability, and energy security, key issues that we're all thinking about as we look at the global landscape. We'll hear from leaders of two important multilateral institutions. First, Matthias Cormann, who previously served as the finance minister in Australia and is already bringing that experience to bear as head of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, better known as OECD. And Dr. Ngozi, Director General of the World Trade Organization, who is playing an important role in restoring vitality to the international trade system. And there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. In the course of the summit today, you'll also hear a little bit about the Summit of the Americas that is taking place in June in LA. The Chamber is honored to host the official private sector forum of the summit, which will bring together business leaders from around the United States and across the hemisphere to drive innovative, practical solutions for a brighter future across the Americas. We hope to see you there. Our competitive starts at home, but it reaches to the shores of Latin America and, of course, beyond. Now, let me kick off our second day guest. It's my honor to introduce His Excellency Guillermo Lasso, President of Ecuador. Because of his very distinguished career in the financial service sector, President Lasso was well known to many in the business community, even before pursuing public office. He is someone who truly understands the role the private sector plays in creating opportunity and improving lives because he has lived it himself. As a result, he has brought that perspective to the presidential palace and created a pro-business climate in Ecuador. And we're delighted to have President Lasso with us today. President Lasso, over to you.
It is an honor to address such a distinguished audience within the framework of this event, organized by the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, a significant institution that promotes the enhancement of trade and investment between the United States and the rest of the world. At the same time, I am grateful for the constant support that the Chamber has given to my country to promote our intention to further deepen our trade relationship with the United States. our main partner in this sector. More than 2 years after the world has been shocked by the COVID-19 pandemic, it is evident that its short-term effects are not limited to health and affect all aspects of daily life. The collapse of health systems, the numerous human lives lost, and the deterioration of the economy have forced countries to adapt to the new reality, some with more success than others. At the beginning of the pandemic, Ecuador experienced a critical situation when the number of COVID-19 cases exceeded the capacity of the public and private health systems. Besides human losses, the confinement greatly limited economic activities, aggravating the state of an economy deteriorated by fiscal deficits and restrictions on foreign trade. One of the very first actions that my government adopted immediately after assuming the governance was the implementation of a vaccination plan to protect the population. The main objective was to immunize 9 million Ecuadorians within the first 100 days of government, a goal that was achieved ahead of schedule. This was possible thanks to the diplomacy of vaccines, in whose framework administrative measures were performed along with the manufacturing companies and allied governments, including the United States, whose generous donation of vaccines was an important component in achieving the proposed goal. By April 2022, the country has a complete vaccination rate of about 88% of the total population, which was fundamental to mitigate the impact of the Omicron variant, as well as to adopt necessary measures for the reactivation of economic activities nationwide. It does not mean that the pandemic has come to an end. The decisions of my government are made progressively and on a scientific evidence basis. In that way, it is possible to correct the direction if necessary. Nevertheless, it is essential to think ahead with optimism and enthusiasm, as with the hope that the threat of future variants, as well as the advancement of science as for vaccinations and treatments, allow us soon to return to complete normalcy. The pandemic has also produced long-term negative effects, both regional and global. The solutions will require a joint and coordinated course of action that allows the exchange of successful experiences and good practices, as well as the assistance to those countries that need it most. This harsh adversity that the planet must confront demands creative solutions. The economic resources of cooperation are essential for developing and least developed countries. However, it is vital that those countries can build their own resilience from external shocks in a sustainable manner. The pandemic caused serious consequences for international trade due to the restriction of activities and logistical constraints that disrupted supply chains. The consumers were constrained in their ability to satisfy their needs, while the producers faced the impossibility of placing their products in different markets. The result was a widespread recession and the loss of millions of employments. At present, inflation rates, the slow recovery of the labor market, the persistent logistical drawbacks of trade, and the increase in migration flows are evidence that resolving the negative effects of the pandemic will take longer than originally estimated. The International Monetary Fund has predicted that growth in Latin America would stagnate. One of the reasons for this phenomenon is the increase in inflation at the regional and global levels. The situation in Ukraine and the economic sanctions imposed on Russia due to its unjustified and unprovoked military action also have inflationary effects, especially on raw materials and food and energy goods. In addition to the impossibility of importing some products and supplies from conflict zones, several countries experience restrictions and limitations in maintaining their exports to these conflict zone countries due to the monetary, logistical, and competitiveness issues. In the case of Ecuador, sectors such as roses, bananas, shrimps, and soluble coffee will all have an impact of around $1.2 billion because they cannot export to Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Both the pandemic and the war have tested the effectiveness of global supply chains. It would be wrong to blame globalization for magnifying the effects of external shocks. That phenomenon has undoubtedly brought benefits in general. In Latin America, it is necessary to complement global chains with regional supply chains without closing the doors to trade coming from other continents. Regional initiatives will allow a faster reaction at continental level that minimizes exposure to global effects, economic phenomena over which there is no control. Therefore, it is necessary for countries such as the United States to reassess its current position of not negotiating new trade agreements. The existence of new agreements, especially with its partners in Latin America and the Caribbean, would allow it to solve many of the problems that it went through in the first months of the pandemic and that still goes through due to the disruption of global supply chains. Meanwhile, the market opening would generate growth and development for the countries of the region, which is critical for the continent to overcome the short and medium-term effects of the pandemic and to organize strategies to deal with the long-term effects. On the other hand, the creation of jobs, thanks to the opening of trade, will have a positive impact on the reduction of migratory flows that increased dramatically due to the economic effects of the pandemic. Besides benefiting the different economies of the region, the reactivation of labor markets will help alleviate the financial impact of the tension that countries such as Ecuador, based on their convictions, have provided to migrants, especially Colombians and Venezuelans, whether they are in transit or seeking refuge. The opening of trade and the economic development of the countries of the region must be supported by the arrival of investments, especially in infrastructure, which is why I consider the Build Back Better World B3W initiative, led by the United States, to be a success. The approach of boosting investment in infrastructure, health, and environmental conservation is an important component of what could be an alternative of regional consensus for the creation of initiatives for the reactivation of continental economy and the multiplication of shorter supply chains that complement those existing globally. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine effects on the American continent should be used to assess a necessary paradigm shift towards strengthening interregional trade ties to strengthen and multiply supply chains in the continent, so that producers have greater certainty about their business and consumers can benefit from a greater diversity of products and lower logistical costs. Besides the will of Latin American countries, the leadership of countries such as the United States is fundamental to the success of this proposal. Thank you all very much.
Ministers, business leaders, distinguished guests, friends all. Technology and innovation are powerful forces for positive change. They are essential to our future prosperity, sustainability, and well-being. We are witnessing a massive digital transformation sweeping across the world and significantly accelerated, of course, in the course of the pandemic and its impact on consumer behaviours and business operations. However, as technologies are rapidly transforming our economies and our everyday lives, responsible governance which keeps pace with developments is critical to optimising the benefits while better managing the potential risks associated with the digital transformation of our economies. Digitalisation has disrupted and reshaped competitive dynamics, creating new markets while transforming existing ones. Ensuring that policies and regulations remain appropriate and well adapted is key. Many economies are still struggling with sluggish productivity growth, declining business dynamism, growing market concentration, and increasing barriers preventing the full beneficial impact of the digital transformation. Indeed, many small and medium-sized enterprises are lagging behind in the digital transition, despite its clear benefits for resilience. For example, our data shows that SMEs, which made over 75% of their sales online, were 15 percentage points more likely to maintain their income during the pandemic. We need to promote policies that can help seize the benefits from the digital economy. More universal access to high-quality digital infrastructure, appropriate digital skills, including by reskilling and upskilling those at risk of being left behind. Policies to boost connectivity, technology diffusion, SME digitalization, cybersecurity, as well as appropriate arrangements for taxation, competition, and of course, digital trade. This includes the need for sensible policies to facilitate cross-border data free flow with trust. An increase in digital connectivity between two countries leads to increased export of goods and services. Digitalization also facilitates border processes, reducing the cost of doing business when border processes are automated. Gains from digital trade are also realized across all sectors of the economy and for countries at all levels of development, benefiting smaller firms and women entrepreneurs in particular. Whether you're trading carrots, cardigans, copper, household appliances or laptops, whether you are a firm in London, Paris or Nairobi, digitalization has the potential to help increase your exports. We also know that digitalization and digital trade have been essential in helping people deal with the consequences of the pandemic and to ensure a collective and speedy recovery. Digitalization allows for new types of trade. It enabled workers to work remotely, even across borders, and deliver their services digitally while facilitating access to goods and services during lockdowns. That being said, these benefits and opportunities are not automatic. Our restrictiveness index on digitally enabled services shows that the global regulatory environment for digital trade has actually become more, not less restrictive since 2014. This means unnecessarily higher costs for businesses and consumers, and it means limiting access to greater economic opportunities. We need to reverse this trend and unleash the full benefits of the digital transformation, while of course appropriately and efficiently mitigating any risks. This requires a strong, coordinated policy response across a range of policy areas. Our response must also reflect and embed a set of core values rooted in protecting human rights as well as championing democratic values and open markets. International cooperation and coordination are key to both the implementation of standards to underpin the architecture of the digital economy and to develop the principles that drive trust across communities, sectors, and jurisdictions. Coordination on policies related to data is a key example, as digital trade often goes hand in hand with cross-border data flows. Our experiences in recent years have underscored the growing importance of data as a multi-purpose resource that can generate significant economic and social benefits when shared across organizations, sectors, and international borders. However, the increasingly pervasive transfer and exchange of data across borders has amplified existing concerns. These include issues around privacy protection, digital security, national security, regulatory reach, competition, and industrial policy. As a result, and as shown by our analysis, we see more and more regulation that conditions the movement of data across borders or regulation that mandates data to be stored locally. The emerging patchwork of rules and regulations is making it difficult to effectively enforce public policy goals, such as privacy and data protection, across different jurisdictions. It is also inhibiting firms' ability to operate across markets, affecting their potential to internationalize and benefit from operating on a global scale. The OECD has been at the forefront of international standard setting in the area of digitalization of the global economy, helping to level the playing field. We are the home of landmark standards on artificial intelligence, on privacy in the digital economy, on data governance, and on consumer protection in e-commerce. These standards are ensuring fair competition between actors on the international arena and are also feeding into ongoing discussions, such as emerging e-commerce chapters in trade agreements and negotiations in the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, as well as in the G7, the G20, and APEC. Through the weight and leadership of OECD countries, these standards can become a shared, collective objective to which all countries can be invited to adhere and be held accountable. This is a unique opportunity to help shape the digital transformation, respond to the technological and global changes that are underway, and ensure that our policies are and remain fit for purpose. The OECD stands ready to work with all stakeholders and to continue to promote international cooperation and dialogue for global solutions to make digital trade more inclusive, more sustainable, and more resilient. Digital trade will continue to play an essential role in our road to recovery, and more so in the context of the reconstruction of Ukraine. So let us work together to design, develop, and deliver better digital trade policies for better lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General Corman, for sharing your thoughts with us this morning. I'm Sean Heather, Senior Vice President of International Regulatory Affairs here at the Chamber. To build on what we just heard, we are pleased to get the perspective from industry, to understand how digital transformation is shaping business, and to hear what that means for data governance. We have perspectives from both the financial services and healthcare industries. Joining us today is the Chief Privacy Officer of Mastercard, Carolyn Laveau, and the Chief Digital Officer of Eli Lilly, Rich Carter. Welcome to you both. Before we talk about data governance and regulation, let's talk about how companies like yours are putting data to good use. Rich, you've been at Eli Lilly for more than 20 years. How have you seen your company digitally transform? And for your industry, where do you think things are headed?
Hey, Sean. Yeah, it's a really interesting space. Digital transformation has been huge for Lilly. It's really affecting everything we do across our entire process. Whether that's things like machine-driven drug discovery, so we're looking at for AI and ML to actually help us develop new medicines, whether that's in the clinical trial space, in the connected trial space, where we're developing digital biomarkers to actually help develop medicines and get them to patients faster, or whether it's in actually connecting and interacting directly with patients to help them who are using our medications improve their overall outcome, by really trying to understand how the medicine is actually helping that specific individual. And I just see that trend continuing across the board as we continue to move forward.
And Carolyn, from your vantage point, how is Mastercard harnessing data-driven innovation?
Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Rich. Well, if you think about it, data is really at the center of commerce, right? So I'm going to give you two examples of how Mastercard, but also the whole financial industry, leverages data for innovation. The first is obviously to protect people from fraud. I think we all know that fraudsters are super smart, so we have to be smarter. And that requires a lot of expertise to develop these very sophisticated anti-fraud tools. But it also requires data. So data has to be collected from across the globe, has to be analyzed so that we can understand the fraud patterns. We can develop these models, and then we can hopefully detect and block fraud in real time. And this is becoming even more important since the pandemic, because as we all know, cyber attacks have been on the rise. And I'm sure that many of you have already received notifications when you were on a trip that your payment account or card credentials may have been compromised. So it really, really works. And the second area that I wanted to highlight is obviously open banking. As you know, open banking is being regulated in many countries around the globe and requires banks to share payment account information with third parties, so that these third parties can develop new innovative services for the benefit of consumers. And so open banking can empower consumers with budgeting, with investment planning, and so much more. And so we have been connecting banks with these third parties and providing them with value-added services. Now, for all these innovations to be embraced by people, they have to be trusted. And I'm sure that we're going to come to that actually, Sean, but obviously these innovations have to be designed with privacy and security top of mind by default and by design.
So Carolyn, let me stay with you. Thinking about designing privacy with cyber and security in mind, what makes for good privacy regulation? How do you actually do that? And let me also ask, what does it mean for a company like Mastercard, who's operating in lots of jurisdictions, when you have different privacy laws that may require you to do different things?
These are tough questions, Sean. So the first one in particular, what makes a good privacy law? So I think a good privacy law provides meaningful protections and rights for people, and at the same time, allows businesses to innovate responsibly with data, and obviously allows businesses to transfer data across the globe. And so a good privacy law is principle-based, because it has to be able to quickly adjust as consumers' expectations and technologies evolve. And then to your question, yes, today we face a tsunami of new laws and regulations that impact how companies can collect, use, and share data. We see new privacy laws in a couple of US states, but also in China, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, Saudi Arabia, and so many more countries, right? And so we end up with a patchwork of laws that introduce highly complex and fragmented standards. So for a global company like ours, how do we really scale our operations while ensuring full compliance? And so let me give you a couple of things, a couple of examples as to how Mastercard is navigating this crazy landscape. So first of all, we design all our products and services with the highest privacy and security standards top of mind. And usually we take the GDPR as our baseline. And that gets us to about 80% of compliance. And then, of course, we make adjustments to comply with the local requirements. Then more and more, we leverage technology to automate and streamline this privacy compliance. And that allows us to create efficiencies in how we handle consumers' data access requests, how we manage their consents, etc. And then we rely on certifications. Mastercard has binding corporate rules, BCRs in place in Europe, in the UK. And we also have the APEC certifications, the cross-border privacy rules and privacy recognition for processors. And these certifications are just great to allow us to transfer data in a compliant way, but even beyond compliance, really to earn and maintain the trust of our consumers. Now, let me finish by saying that I'm still a little bit concerned. And I'm concerned because this may not be enough in a world where data localization becomes the norm. And so we really need to reopen the dialogue about developing global or at least compatible standards on privacy, data, and technology. And I'm really thrilled to see the announcement from the US Department of Commerce that the APEC CDPRs will be extended to become a global CDPR forum on data flows. That actually is super aligned with what we have been advocated for, is to have a multilateral scheme that facilitates trusted data flows. And obviously, we are also very pleased to see the declaration for the future of the internet announced by the US and Europe and so many more countries. And so I would invite everyone to join this dialogue, because it's only through a collective effort and dialogue that we're going to be able to achieve these common standards and make that global digital economy work for everyone and everywhere.
I think you gave two examples of good policy forums, such as the Declaration on the Future of the Internet and this new approach to opening up APEC CBPRs, because I think you hit home the point that moving data across borders is fundamental to today's economy. Rich, as the chief digital officer, thinking about things beyond privacy, there are actually very few regulations that govern data. Yet increasingly, governments are kind of considering policy responses to things like AI. Where do you see data governance headed, and how do you think that might vary from one jurisdiction to the next?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Sean. I think Caroline shared a lot about how we should collect data and how we do that in the right way, following the right approaches and the right processes. I actually think there's an advancement that we need, which is how do we leverage that data and how do you turn that into insight, but how do you make sure that's valid insight and there's consistency across that? So if you take my industry, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, if we generate an information and insight around a patient and the use of the medication, we want to make sure if we're feeding that back to a physician, that the physician can believe and trust in that information and insight that we're providing. So I think there's not only standards in terms of how do you actually collect and collate this information, but then how do you actually validate that, and how do you validate the output so that the person, the organizations, and all of the stakeholders that want to use that information believe in that source, believe in the data, and there's consistency across, so that if it's coming from different parties, the output is the same or accepted in the same way. I think that's an evolution that we need to get into and start to understand how we collaborate across things like that piece, as well as just safely collecting, storing, and then using the information appropriately.
Well, I'd like to get both of your perspectives on regulators and the role of regulators. Do you all think that regulators are well equipped to regulate the digital transformation we see happening in the economy?
I think, Sean, on my side, I think we work obviously very closely with the FDA, and I think there's good partnership and good collaboration there as things like software as medical device become more prevalent, as digital biomarkers become more prevalent. I think what we're seeing is a need to actually collaborate and work together to understand both what's possible and what's feasible, but how we actually do that in the right way, how we ensure patient safety, certainly in my industry, and really partner and get around the table together, because things are emerging so quickly that without that dialogue, it would be very difficult to actually use the information appropriately, use the tools that are now available to us to actually deliver improved patient outcomes. So I think communication and collaboration is going to be a very important part of moving forward.
And Caroline, do you think that the regulators are asking the right questions before they regulate? Obviously, there's a lot of financial services regulators, not only in the United States, but around the world. With these conversations in fintech and the like, are they asking the right questions?
That's a very good question, Sean. So let me first say that it's a new space, right? And it sometimes feels to me that it's like we're building a new plane, but fixing it and flying it all at the same time. So a little bit uncomfortable. And so what regulators are we talking about first? Because, in our world, we have obviously data protection authorities, as long as we are dealing with personal information, but we also have sectorial regulators, central banks or financial regulators. Then you have consumer protection agencies, antitrust regulators, soon AI regulators, right, Rich? So no one is going to be able to solve this by their own. And so in order to, first of all, ask us the right questions and then actually hopefully find solutions to these complex privacy, security, and ethical challenges, to which point they're going to have to work together. And we're going to have to find a governance mechanism so that the decisions are being made while taking all these different perspectives into account. And I would like to add one more thing, is that it's also going to be crucial to involve experts across a diversity of disciplines: law, security, but also technology, psychology, ethicists, economists, and maybe so much more. And involve experts also from different cultures. This is all going to be required if we want actually to find solutions to these complex issues.
So it sounds like getting all the right people around the table for this conversation is part of the answer. Both of you touched on this earlier, which is the importance of kind of finding that right balance between regulation and innovation. Do you find that regulators are striking that right balance, or do you think regulators are struggling to find the right balance?
I think it's an evolving space. I think over time we'll get the right balance. I think there's many different players in the health space right now who are really trying to move forward and drive advancement in capability. You saw in the pandemic the speed with which new medicines and vaccines were delivered. And I think there was really good dialogue there in order to do that, really good partnership. I think we need to sustain that dialogue and that partnership to advance those agendas and really come together. When some of the why, the momentum from something like a pandemic dissipates, I think we need to continue to work together in that way and really continue to drive and advance the agenda, but balancing risk at the same time.
Does innovation look different from your... Go ahead.
Yeah, look, I want actually to echo what Rich has just been saying. And I'm wondering whether we could also explore how regulatory sandboxes could play a role here. You know that regulatory sandboxes allow companies to test their new ideas, their innovations, new technologies in a safe and controlled environment while receiving guidance from regulators, hopefully across different countries and disciplines. And so these sandboxes offer multiple benefits. They're allowed to uncover new challenges that then can be addressed. But also new opportunities that may lead to more innovation. And then these sandboxes allow to bring regulators up to speed on new business models, new technologies, and could be actually a very useful tool to rebuild the trust between regulators and industry. So we're seeing a couple of these regulatory sandboxes in some countries like the UK, in Singapore. It would be great to invest more in this space because I think it's going to be crucial to strike the right balance between regulation and innovation.
So, Caroline, I think you've hit on a couple of times the importance of trust. What do you think, in particular with these regulatory sandboxes that are now emerging as a best practice in several jurisdictions, what could regulators learn from industry?
I think, Sean, they can learn a lot. They can learn about, how a product is being designed, from the very early stage of the development until the launch phase. I think very often it's unclear to regulators of how it works. And then actually, what are the judgment calls that need to be made in that context? They can learn about new technologies because regulators are not always up to speed on the new technologies emerging. So it's really bringing regulators closer to the industry and to the market.
And Rich, obviously, when you're talking about the FDA as the U.S. regulator in this space, they're there for an enforcement perspective. Is that awkward to have them in on the early stages of the development of a new product as almost a partner in the development? Is that an awkward situation, or is that one that is ultimately where we're headed and need to be?
Yeah, I think it's, Sean, I think it's one where we actually need to be. I think we've seen that evolution with some of the work we've been doing over the last couple of years, where having them at the table is actually a critical part of that. I think, as Caroline said, being aware and being open to being educated and understanding some of the new concepts and the new capabilities and what the value is going to be for the individual or the patient in our case at the end of that is actually really important. And I think openness to change is probably the biggest risk there. I think as long as people are open to change and evolution with the right education, and we face this internally as well as with the regulatory bodies, right? Not always in my world, in the digital space, we're a pharma company and not everybody is on board with the change. They don't understand it. And once you start to educate and you start to understand the possibilities and the value that it can create and the way you can do that in a safe and effective way, I think that's probably the biggest thing we need to do. But openness to change, and then the partnership, and I think we can do great things together. We saw that through the pandemic with the speed of vaccines and therapies coming to market. And if we can continue to do that, I think we'll be in a good place for the future.
So let me close with this question. In both of your opening kind of sets of comments, you talked about the fact that there are multiple jurisdictions leaning in on these issues. So how important is it for regulatory cooperation when it comes to these issues among jurisdictions?
I'm happy actually to answer this one, and I'm sure that Rich has a point of view as well. Look, it's critical. It's a must-have. I think there's not even actually a choice there. Data is global. It has no frontiers. It's our new reality. So it's going to be absolutely critical for regulators across jurisdictions to work with each other. And actually, I would add across sectors, etc. But I think you heard that.
Rich, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I think I would echo everything Caroline just said. I think data is the individuals, and as individuals travel and move, the data needs to move with them, and they own that. So I think she summarized that perfectly.
Well, I want to thank you, Carolyn and Rich, for both of you sharing your views today. And again, want to express our appreciation to the Secretary General for kicking off this discussion. Next up is our segment on delivering sustainability, resilience, and development. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Rockland, founder and CEO of Impact ROI. I've spent more than 25 years advising companies and organizations across the entire economy on sustainability issues. And I'm joined by a business leader who has an important perspective on sustainability on the international stage. Mike Parra is CEO of DHL Express Americas, an organization uniquely positioned across supply chains and with clear commitments to climate goals. He's had the role since 2016 and is well positioned to share his insights on the importance of sustainability practices and the innovations that will help companies achieve their climate goals. Please welcome Mike Parra. So Mike, let me start by asking, DHL is part of a carbon-intensive industry. Logistics has a lot of trucks, planes, and buildings. Why is sustainability important to you, and how are you making commitments?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to those who are listening in. First of all, DHL is proud to play a role in essential services in the global economy, and we know that we have a responsibility to help others, which is why our mission statement is connecting people, improving lives. And as an outcome of that mission statement, DHL has been a global leader in not only in the space of environmental, social, and governance program, but its expansive sustainability roadmap. you may or may not know, but in 2008, the group set a carbon efficiency target to have 30% improvement in efficiencies. And after hitting that target early, we went ahead and became the first, DHL became the first company in the logistics space in the world to set a target to reduce its greenhouse emissions by net zero, to be at net zero by 2050, which which we are well on our way. And last year, we decided to accelerate our ESG initiatives with new ambitious science-based targets, which is important from that perspective around CO2 reduction, and a commitment to spend $8 billion in sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable maritime fuel, vehicle electrification, buildings with becoming all climate neutral. And with all of that, you can see us begin to see how sustainability is not just being a side program. It's a core characteristic for the company, to the point where we've even are tying our corporate board incentives to our sustainable targets as well.
Mike, that's fantastic. Now, let me ask, there's a lot of focus on available solutions like electric vehicles and building efficiency. What are the most impactful solutions that you're employing at DHL?
Well, we're taking a look, and that's another good question. Thank you for that. As part of our sustainability roadmap, our focus is going to be, first of all, on our buildings. And we already have pivoted to high energy efficiency lighting, solar panels on roofs, and new on our large and existing buildings as well. We're also buying power from wind projects from that perspective. And going forward, our commitment is that all of our new buildings will be carbon neutral and include charging infrastructure to handle future electric vehicle delivery vans. On the surface, our focus is on delivery vehicles, long-haul trucking, as well as ground support equipment. For example, we made a commitment that by 2030, 60% of all of our delivery vehicles across the world are going to be electrified, and we're already a quarter of a way there. We've got 20,000 electric vehicles on the road. We're also have a goal of introducing sustainable fuels, 30% for our long-haul trucking fleet as well, which is low carbon technology, as well as bio-natural gas, even hydrogen. And in Cincinnati, as an example, we've already introduced the first hydrogen pushback tugs that are pushing back our aircraft. What I would add as one last thing, Steve, is, and it's really a thought, is that it comes with we really need most of the authorities to start to address the surface transportation for passenger cars. But the area of opportunity for us that we see is the focusing on helping on the commercial fleet. That's the bigger challenge, and any support that we can get there obviously is appreciated.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Mike, let's look to the future, and what technologies are most exciting to you in helping to move the needle on climate change?
Really 3 areas. So thank you for that one as well. Number 1 is in refleeting our air operations. Our biggest CO2 emissions as a transportation company is in the air. That's the biggest. So with that, we've been replacing our aircraft with new efficiency Boeing 777 aircraft, and we've put in an order for 28. We've taken delivery of 16 of those. And over the last 4 years, we've seen already a reduction and an improvement of 18% more, a more energy efficient fleet. So that's a big focus there. The second part of it in the fleet and in the air is optimizing our route. So pre-engine flight cleaning that's taking place, plus really the work that we're doing with our pilots on not over thrusting. And really taxiing out with 1 engine versus 2, and then firing up the second engine right before takeoff, all very safe and done in the right way. The second focus is around sustainable aviation fuel, which I just talked about earlier. And DHL continues to work with SAF producers and startup both in the US and in Europe. And recently we signed a deal with Neste and Air BP for one of the largest SAF offtake agreements to date globally, some 800 million liters and 211 million gallons for use in Europe and in the US over the next 5 years. Again, a big commitment on our end. And then finally, electric aircraft. We found an organization in Western Washington some 18 months ago a company called Aviation, and we have purchased 12 electric aircraft. They're called Alice, and they carry a payload capacity of 2,600 pounds or 1,200 kilograms. And we're going to use those aircraft starting in 2025 on some short line haul lanes that we have in the United States. So part 6 will go in the Southeast and 6 of them will go in the West Coast.
That's incredibly exciting to hear. So let me ask, as you at DHL know well, collaboration across companies, countries, and supply chains is necessary to meeting sustainability goals. And so how are you working with your partners at the corporate and government levels to increase sustainability across the whole economic system?
Yeah, so first, I think it's important. The first one is in terms of collaboration, we continue to maintain a partnership with dozens of cargo airlines that we use due to our global reach. And to really make a difference, we need to control not only our own emissions, known as what we would call Scope 1, but also work with our air cargo partners. And we're doing that to reduce their emissions, known as Scope 3. So that's one of it. We also know that collaborating with the governments is critical. And we have an obligation as a major global company, along with our partners and competitors, to drive the public policy agenda. And we have a public policy office in DC, and the team, which I support as well, does a really good job in that. On our second point about the nexus of sustainability and supply chain resilience, the nuances often overlooked. When people discuss sustainability, they can focus on the environment part of ESG, but the social and governance components are also critical, and economic access and reliability are critical as well. So that is big. And during COVID-19, we saw shortages. We saw delays of everything from toilet paper to cars. And some governments want to respond by maintaining reshoring production and supply chain. Unfortunately, new trade barriers only further constrain global supply chains and our ability to respond to new threats. So at this moment, the vulnerability for us is the last thing we should be considering are trade restrictions and barriers to reduce or even eliminate global value chains. No country, and I say this every time while I'm in Washington, and I'll be there next week as well, is no country can operate in isolation. And the increased tariffs or trade barriers or reshoring mandates creates inefficiency in production and perpetuate a supply chain risk. So my hope is that we take the right lessons away from the pandemic, and that is that supply chains matter, that resilient supply chains are enabled by diverse supply chains, and that as tempting as it is to make everything here, right, or erect more trade barriers, I say this all the time, trade equals jobs. And over the last 3 years, we've added over 8,000 new jobs, and that's been associated to trade and the growth in the trade, in and out of every country that we have.
And so when we start thinking about, it's been on the front pages, it's amazing how supply chain has become a sort of common issue, a mainstream issue. And so when we look beyond sustainability, what's key to supply chain resiliency from your perspective?
We're looking for more support, especially in the space of R&D into commercial use. That one is one that we have been talking about for some time in the organization, and it'll help us to really, areas such as medium or heavy duty trucks need new SAF pathways. And the government really right now is only able to invest in broad R&D. So that would be one. Invest in related infrastructure beyond the traditional infrastructure and networks. Government investment in charging station and alternative fuel distribution will be essential in facilitating the ability for companies to access supply. So that's important for us. And for example, DHL has come together with others in Northern Kentucky, which is a big area for us, to maximize the multiple booming cargo hubs, good infrastructure and natural resources to make SAF in a commercially viable environment. The third point I would bring up would be incentivized uptake. Even when technology is available, I've already mentioned how the price of sustainable alternatives like EV trucks can be overwhelming due to the quantity. That's why taking a look at the infrastructure to support larger trucks I just mentioned before is important, where everything is built more on, smaller cars and smaller vehicles. And we're honored to be part of the Biden administration of SAF Grand Challenge to produce 3 billion gallons of SAF annually by 2030. And we're a big supporter of the blender's tax credit, which will help increase production and shrink existing price gap. And then the last point I'll make on this one would be to collaborate across borders. And, Canada has a recent example, a recent release of its ambitious emissions reduction plan and the creation of the Canadian Council of Sustainable Aviation Fuel, or CSAF, as well as other efforts underway in their countries, such as Chile, which we've been talking to as well, which is hoping to leverage its vast hydrogen resources and production of SAF. So that would be, really 4 quick points that I can make on that.
Those are excellent points, and a lot of them address public policy. I'm just curious, any other areas that you'd like to see government take action to speed up the process of advancing sustainability, or have you covered it?
I've covered them all, I would say, in my opinion, if we could get those 4.
That sounds fantastic. So let me ask now, each company is different in the way it approaches sustainability and the way it can best meet its goals. How important is it to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach and give companies flexibility to do what's best in terms of meeting their sustainability commitments?
We're a company that has 5 different divisions. And for each one of our divisions, what we quickly realized, where we're a family of businesses, we each have, it's not the best way to say, well, one size fits all when you come into the space of sustainability. So it's important that that a framework, number one, be established with well-known and externally verifiable standards. In DHL case, we're using science-based targets, and we said to ourselves that SBTI, which uses globally established standards, is not only well respected, but it's the road that we're headed on. So that's number one. We also know that as more customers and transportation partners become interested in tracking their carbon footprints, a transparent, modern carbon accounting system is needed. So this is an ask, is needed to ensure proper calculation on carbon use is used for the transportation of goods. So that's the second one. And then DHL has increasingly used what's called the book and claim mechanism, which is a digital system that tracks and transfers the emission reductions from sustainable fuels across the value chain. And we believe such a chain of custody is important system, which will help ramp up the use of sustainable fuels as companies work to understand how much carbon is used in transportation of shipments, whether it's around the corner or across the world. And we're offering our customers, really our large multinational customers at a certain level and above, we offer a free annual report to them of their emissions saved while using DHL. And we provide that report at the moment once a year, free of charge. So again, that's why we're saying one size doesn't fit all. But again, if we can get some of these things going based on science-based targets, we should be fine.
And those are incredible services. Let me ask, how can business groups like Chambers help you as you move forward to your climate goals?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Again, another good question. I appreciate that and appreciate you asking, Steve. All of us, understand addressing the climate crisis isn't only a business responsibility, a government responsibility, or consumer-only effort. It's going to take us all. So that collaboration that we were talking about was important. And this requires a holistic and a collaborative effort to identify feasible goals and practical solutions. And the Chamber, as a voice of the business, plays a key role in that discussion. So that's number one. We've benefited from working with the Chamber, as an example, and their staff of expertise, creating a space for the public and private sectors to come together to be better informed or to work together with governments around the globe, and events like the Global Forum that we're talking about and other programming that the Chamber serve as a premier convener of experts and officials. And these type of discussions really do contribute to a global marketplace of ideas. And we appreciate and value that. And that's a big part of our support of the Chamber as well. And then finally, I would say that it's business groups that can play the convener role and promote more collective movement if it ultimately helps set standards, promote policy, and facilitate change that benefits companies and the environment. So I would say those are the three, underlying all with the sense that we started at the beginning with, which is all the importance of collaborating and working together.
And Mike, with the time that we have left, if you don't mind, you started by talking a little bit about how DHL manages sustainability. Could you expand on that a little bit? Where does the responsibility and the accountability lie, and which staff get involved?
Well, it starts with our corporate board and our supervisory board who set and agreed with our ESG strategy. We put together this lighthouse 2 years ago and made a sound commitment to the 570,000 employees that we have globally of what our commitment was and in the importance of making a difference in the planet that we live in and that we serve in. So by setting up our ESG strategy, by setting up the goals and by measuring them, we measure them every single month. Every time I have a board meeting, we have a review of our ESG targets and the KPIs that we have in each one of the key areas of environment, social, and governance. We have key individuals that own each one of those specific areas. So we not only report them on a monthly basis, but we also report on a quarterly basis, and we share those with our shareholders and with our employees, and we let them know how we're tracking to our goals. So that was one. Number two was the financial commitment that we made that I talked about earlier, which was 8 billion euros of our profitability is going towards the space of sustainability. And then we're tracking how we're doing to those and reporting to those effectively. And then it's the physical programs that are applied to it, and then making sure that we're following up on those.
Mike, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. It's both enlightening and inspirational, gives us tremendous food for thought. Really appreciate us. I really appreciate the time you've spent with us, and look forward to hearing more about what DHL is doing in the future.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate the time and appreciate your patience with me as well.
Thanks so much.
Hello, I am Gary Littman, Senior Vice President for Global Initiatives at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As we've just heard, sustainable business practices are more important to companies than ever. For many companies, they have become an integral part of their competitiveness strategy, and it's a global trend. It's a trend driven by expectations from U.S. and international policymakers, customers, employees, and shareholders. It is a significant driving force across sectors, from construction to banking, and obviously financing the green transition is a key subject matter. I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of experts who can share how they're delivering on these commitments. Please welcome Daniel Hanna, Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Standard Chartered Bank, Vivek Pathak, Global Head of Climate Business at International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, and Dr. Srinivas Viramasuneni, Chief Technology Officer at USG Corporation. Thank you all for joining, and let's get to the conversation. Let me start with Daniel. Daniel, as a global bank with an enormously deep client base in emerging markets, how do you adjust your instruments, your toolbox, to the transition needs and different capacity levels across different regions?
Harry, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to the Chamber for hosting, I think, this very important conversation. So I think, first of all, from Standard Chartered's perspective, we have committed to being a net zero finance organization. We're also the chair of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And we are moving our operations to be net zero by 2025. And crucially, I think to your question, we are aligning our financings to be net zero by 2050. And we've put out a series of interim targets for 2030, aligned to the IEA's net zero scenario. But we really believe passionately that banking needs to support clients decarbonize through this journey, which is why, one, we set out a commitment to fund $300 billion of transition and green finance focused on the emerging markets. And two, we've set up a dedicated team of transition bankers who are working with key industries to see how we can accelerate the decarbonization in those industries in the world. And I think the key part of this as well is that we can't just do this in the developed markets, we need to do this everywhere. We put out a piece of research recently called Just in Time, which shows that the cost of decarbonizing the emerging markets is significant. $93 trillion to get the emerging markets to achieve net zero by 2060. Now, if we ask the emerging markets to do that on their own, that's actually going to make them $68 trillion worse off. But if the developed world and if we collectively support that transition, not only will emerging markets be $68 trillion better off, but actually we expect developed markets GDP to grow by $4 trillion as well. So it's really critical that we transition the whole world as we move to this kind of net zero economic environment.
Let me go to Vivek. Vivek, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Vivek, IFC, as part of the World Bank, has been a pioneer in sustainability finance. You were there before anybody else. Right now, as we're hearing from the private sector, there's a lot of money, there's an abundance of financial resources, which seems to even exceed the capacity to generate bankable projects, projects that would be truly transformative and yet generate some profits. What are the new instruments? What's the new position of IFC? What are you offering to the green finance transition right now?
Sure, thanks so much, Gary, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here. But before I dive into the question, I wanted to comment on the first point that you made, that there is plenty of money. Yes, there is plenty of capital, but the capital, unfortunately, is at a place here, and the needs are somewhere else. So I think we need to understand that the capital wants certain returns, it wants a certain risk profile, and it comes with certain amount of currency risk. Yeah. And I think what's important to mention is that when we are coming across well-structured, bankable projects with a fair risk reward, capital typically is not in shortfall. There is no shortfall of capital for that. Yeah. And there are a number of cases in some of the most challenging markets in Asia and Africa where we structured deals and we never had a problem raising capital. But the question is, how do we now spend a lot more time and effort than we've ever done before to make these deals? How do you make these deals happen? So we at IFC have something called Upstream, and to clarify, it's nothing to do with upstream oil and gas. It's actually an initiative where we say we want to engage early with governments, we want to engage early with the private sector, where we can help both parties work together along with ourselves and our colleagues at the World Bank and other MDBs to actually come up with a pool of projects which will be more bankable. And that is really what our objective is. And that's what we've done for decades. But what we are now trying to do is to really scale it up and take it to a level that we haven't seen before. Another point which is important to make is that people are used to a certain risk profile there. And I think what governments are saying and the private sector is saying in many of these markets is, we are not going to give you those perfect deals that you had 15, 20 years ago. And we've seen that in a number of markets. So we also need to recognize that risk profiles are changing, and a lot of the banks have to start changing their risk appetite, at least the perception of risk appetite, to get into some of these emerging markets. Unfortunately, the recent events in a number of big countries, has unfortunately taken the risk appetite or the profile the other direction, whether it's unfortunate war in Ukraine, or what we've just seen recently in Sri Lanka, and even in some of the more challenging markets like Myanmar and Afghanistan. So I think what we really need to do is to work together and come up with these projects with the private sector, with the government, with reform. But in order to de-risk them, we also need some amount of blended finance or de-risking capital. And that's another area where we're very focused on. So a combination of these, we think would get us to hopefully a point where a large part of this capital can come in and finance these projects in emerging markets. Thanks.
Thank you, Vivek. Srinivas, shifting to you, we've heard from the financial sector, but you represent the construction materials sector, which actually has to remain competitive, cost competitive, while undertaking the green transition. How do you strategize to remain competitive in an environment where you have to spend a lot of resources to come up with new materials, new solutions, and yet generate profits?
Thanks, Gary. It's nice to be here with finance and banking friends here, both Vivek and Daniel. To answer your question, it's very interesting. If you look at the environment, more than 40% of the total carbon emissions actually are coming from buildings, whether it's existing buildings or the new buildings. It's a challenge, and also it's an opportunity, I think, as a company that actually participates in building materials to really make a difference. And we believe this is an opportunity to differentiate in the market through innovation, but also to bring that competitive advantage for us. And USG as a company has been innovating for more than 120 years, but we started this focused journey on sustainability 10 years back. And just last month in April, we also announced our 2030 challenge, or our 2030 goals in the next decade. And one is obviously because we want to reduce carbon to achieve the net zero by 2050. We actually came out with a goal of 30% reduction in our operations by 2030. But as the other speakers talked about, when we talk about sustainability, it's not just reducing the carbon. We're also focusing on customer well-being. That means we are committed to eliminate all red list chemicals in the next decade. And also, we are focusing on delivering a circular economy. We're also committed to have a zero waste at our plants. I think combination of all these activities, we believe that will position us and differentiate us in the market.
Thank you, Srinivas. It's very important that you're bringing up the circular economy and efficient use of natural materials. It works in many advanced economies, but Vivek, I want to go back to you for a second, because you brought up the issue of the most vulnerable nations. Is there a particular approach that you at IFC and other MDBs are considering to help with climate adaptation for the vulnerable markets, which really are going to be suffering the most in the immediate future? What's the thinking within the MDB community and IFC in particular?
So thanks, Gary. And that's really what I would call a billion, if not $1 trillion question. So one of the challenges with adaptation that we're all struggling with is how do we attract private capital to adaptation? And that's something which is not easy to do. So far, adaptation has largely been a play for sovereigns. So the World Bank, our sister institution, does a lot of that. Almost 52% of the climate actually goes into adaptation. So we are looking at different platforms, and we will need a fair amount of de-risking capital to make it happen. So I'll just give you a very easy example so that people can understand that easier. If tomorrow you need to build a seawall to protect a coastal community in a country, that's not for the private sector to do. That's for the government to do. But if you had a few hotels, or if you had a number of hotels there, that can be done in the form of a PPP, because the hotels can pay some sort of fee. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at. Plus, I think one of the biggest challenges today is that there is really no cost at a global level to water and biodiversity. And unless and until we can assign or allocate a cost to that, I think it's going to be much harder to get private capital to come in. So we are looking at a number of platforms today, but it's baby steps, to be honest, and a lot more needs to be done. And we need to find ways to make these bankable and financeable. And that's what, as I mentioned earlier, is some of our early stage thinking is going into that space right now.
Daniel, that brings up private banking. The next COP in Egypt will likely focus in particular on climate adaptation and how it should be financed. What's the thinking in the private sector about climate adaptation? Are there opportunities there that you're considering, or some new instruments that you may propose?
Yeah, I mean, I think To pick up, I think, on Vivek's earlier comments as well, we need to think about not just where climate adaptation as a theme, but also where is that climate adaptation actually going to take place? Because it's the low-income countries that are at the most significant risk from the impacts of climate change, and actually also have the biggest opportunity to leapfrog into low-carbon sort of economies, low-carbon business models. And I think we're thinking about this in a number of different ways. I think Vivek talked about blended finance. We're a big supporter and user of blended finance. We've done more than $15 billion of transactions using blended finance techniques focused in countries like Africa, the Middle East. And I think there is an opportunity to think about how that can be creatively applied to in terms of adaptation. I think as well, we're really keen to grow transition finance as an asset class and thinking about how we can decarbonize certain technologies and leverage the success that we've seen in green finance to move into transition finance. We did the first transition bond for an airline in Etihad, but we're also working in Africa around transitioning, decarbonizing in cement, and also in terms of reducing flaring. So I think there's all this impact. And the final aspect that we haven't talked about is actually the role of carbon markets. We believe that there are a number of ways to leverage good quality carbon credits to channel funds into areas such as climate adaptation, biodiversity in low-income markets, and thinking creatively about how we can combine those with other existing financial products, maybe a new way to move capital to where it's really needed.
Thank you, Daniel. That gives us all some hope that you'll come up with good solutions together with MDBs through blended finance and other instruments. Srinivas, if I may go back to you for a moment. Obviously, a lot of hope in climate adaptation and circular economy rests on the expectation of technological breakthroughs. And particularly we hear about the value of digitalization, digital economy as something that might be very helpful here, but will also require a lot of investment, a lot of financing, a lot of work. And while you have to remain competitive, could you share with us how you see the digital revolution, and also in terms of drivers of what motivates you? I understand, we all understand the kind of existential needs, but also is the pressure coming from regulators? Is the pressure coming from the financial sector, the employees? What are the main drivers? And also if you could address the impacts of the digital revolution on your particular sector.
Thank you for both questions. First of all, I think, Daniel, it's good to see that you are investing on also on cement and concrete, how to reduce the carbon. I think we all need to work together, I think, to get to this net zero challenge. First, go back to the question about maybe what are the drivers. Obviously, there is always regulations, but we believe innovation always has to meet the customer needs. So in our case, the focus and the drivers are, it's our customers and the millennial generation, and it's ourselves, because it's the right thing to do. I think reducing the carbon, making the sustainable world is the right thing to do. First, on the customer side, we do have different segments like architects, dealers, and contractors, but I think most of the need or the requests are coming from the architectural community. A few years back, architectural community got together and they put themselves at the 2030 challenge. That is, their goal is to have a net zero buildings by 2030. I think USG is actually signed for the 2030 challenge, and our goal is to develop products to help architects to achieve their goals. And in the millennial case, as most of you are aware, the young generation wants to live in homes that are built by sustainable materials, and they want to work for the companies that are actually focusing and give priority for sustainability. And as I said, last but not the least, as a company itself, we think it's the right thing to do, and then we are investing heavily to make sure that we develop sustainable products and as well as keep our operations with low carbon emissions. As an example, just a few years back, we commercialized a product called EcoSpot. It's the lightest and most sustainable products in the world, with a 30% less embodied carbon energy than any other gypsum-based products in the world. As we are talking about, I believe to make sure these products goes into the market and meets the customer needs, we not only have to have sustainable attributes, but I think we need to add certain attributes so that it reaches to all customer segments. For example, in this product, we not only increased its sustainability profile, but we made it so light so that our dealer community and as well as contractors really like this product. So that's what we believe is at this time, if the customers are not willing to pay premium just for the sustainability attribute, we want to make sure we actually add other attributes so that we drive these products into the market so that eventually it becomes a norm in the market. Now, coming to the digital aspects, it's really true. And we personally believe digital will move sustainability faster. You are hearing every company, every sector embracing digital, and the digital transformation is now becoming a norm in all the companies. But at USG, we believe digital is going to help us in 3 different areas. One, in our operations. Second is with our customers. Third, with development of new products. Let me take a few seconds on each one of them. First, with our operations, between our 4 walls, having these digital tools will help us to measure and as well as to monitor the progress we are making as we are trying to reduce the carbon in our operations. And then second, on the customer side, by having all our products easily available for architects to be able to choose and select, I think will help the adoption of our products and more sustainable products into the market. And finally, for 100 years, we have been making products that has so many attributes, but they're all passive in nature. But using these digital tools and sensor technology, we can make our products to be more active. And then that way, even after the buildings are built, we can actually use these digital tools to reduce the carbon during the operations of the buildings. So it's an exciting time. And I think working together, I think we can make a change in this world and make sustainability as a priority for everyone.
Wonderful, Srinivas, that's very interesting, exciting. Daniel and Vivek, let me switch back. Let's go first to Daniel. We've now heard the vision from the construction industry, active buildings who are helping their dwellers to fight climate change and improve efficiency. What should we be watching in the financial sector? What kind of innovation should be on our mind? Where policymakers should provide additional support, looking into kind of intermediate future? What should be on our radar screen? Let's go to Daniel first.
That's a big question, Gary. So I think, look, this is hard stuff. I think we are seeing both industry and finance and the need for them both to be rewired. And effectively, the finance challenge is that we can support our clients in these industries in decarbonization and really move the real economy in this period. But equally, I think we can only move so far if we can't do it on our own. So this, I think, to pick up on what Vas said, the key thing in all of this is going to be collaboration across finance, across the real economy, across regulators, governments, and countries, and really tackling, I think, Vas sort of said, on specific problems. So, we've talked about cement. Let's talk about steel. We're one of the founding signatories to the the Climate Aligned Task Force on decarbonizing steel. We need to look at some of these hard to abate sectors and really think collectively how we can drive a sort of more net zero pathway across both finance and industry. So it's the collaboration where I would really put the focus.
Can I just stay with you for one more second, Daniel? I understand that you can provide financing to steel industry and other industries. What happens if companies are unable to deliver on the benchmarks that they pledged? Technology doesn't always happen the way we want it to happen. Markets change. We see commodity volatility. What happens then? How are you thinking about that? I know it's probably not an easy question.
No, not an easy question, and also not a small question. So let me try and be brief to it. But I think in working out our net zero pathway, we have worked with our clients and categorized them against whether they are currently net zero aligned or whether they will become net zero aligned or whether they're not really thinking about transition at all. And that's why we set up an ESG advisory team to work with them to sort of develop their transition strategies. If they're not doing that, why we built a transition finance team to support the new technologies and how the new risk awareness of those technologies in terms of our financing. Ultimately, if a client isn't prepared to do that, and I think isn't going to see that opportunity for them going forward, then we will have to look at whether they can still be a client for this bank. So we will have to take some exits. But we're a big believer in engagement, not divestment. Finance can be part of the solution. But we really want to focus on the clients that will transition over a period of time. This is not going to happen over the next year. This is a multi-year journey, and we want to be there for those clients that want to take that journey with us.
Thank you, Daniel. And obviously the Chamber also is a huge believer and supporter of engagement rather than divestment. You don't walk away from problems and think that they will take care of themselves. Vivek, let me give you the last word in this conversation. From IFC's point of view, what are you looking for the next several years? And obviously, at the next couple COPs, what will that change in the way you operate, the way you can deliver value in sustainability?
So I think thanks so much, Gary, and I'll touch upon it. It's so good to have somebody from the construction material sector here, because normally we don't have these people. This sector is actually going to be absolutely critical to decarbonize. Steel, cement, if you don't decarbonize them, that's almost 14 to 15% of global GHG emissions. And it's not going to be an easy journey. I think what we all need is, we need patience. And you asked Daniel that question. I've just got a question from a CFO for a large steel company that we're talking to. And he said, I'm willing to do all this, but hey, what if steel prices come down 3 years down the road? I have a limited pool of cash flow. Should I be going and doing what you asked me to do, which we believe in doing? Or should I be keeping my steel mills running and keeping my employees employed and cash flows running? So that's not an easy question. And that's where we need to be clear on what does this really mean? What does transition really mean? So that's one thing that we're going to be very focused on going forward. What is transition finance? What are the risks? And how can we really make it work? And this cannot be a one size fits all. The second area that's going to be critical, and we're going to be focusing on, and I know Daniel's focusing a lot on, is carbon markets. We really need to work with the governments, with other multilaterals, with the UN, to try and get to a stage where carbon markets are functioning, transparent, because without that, I think the 1.5 degrees is going to be relatively harder to achieve, because again, it's about pricing, it's about costs here. And the last thing is about technology. I am a big believer that some of the big innovations are going to come through technology. Some of these technologies are either not tried and tested or haven't been scaled up. So using them, particularly in the construction material sector, is expensive. How do we drive down these costs with some amount of blended finance, some amount of technological improvements? So it's going to be a combination of all these, and that's really where we are putting a lot of our energy going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Vivek. That's very important. I'm very happy that we were able to bring the financial sector and construction sector together, the beginning of collaboration. That's what the Chamber is all about. I would add one more maybe dimension to what you've said. It's multilateralism. It's very important, I think, for all of us in these tough times to make sure that organizations like yours are able to function. And climate is a global issue, and multilateral organizations are playing a fantastically important role here. So thank you all for your tremendous insights. Next up, we will hear from Peter Huntsman, CEO of the Huntsman Corporation, in a conversation about energy security with the Chamber's own Marty Durbin. Over to you, Marty.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Peter Huntsman, Chairman, President, and CEO of Huntsman Corporation, a global company with a storied name in chemical manufacturing business and a leader in innovation. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Marty, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So Huntsman has grown and evolved quite a bit in its 50-year history. To start with, perhaps you can give our audience an idea of what Huntsman's footprint looks like today and kind of where you see both Huntsman and the broader petrochemicals industry heading in the global economy.
I think the history of our company is probably quite reminiscent of what the industry by and large is doing. When I think of the history of our company, we started off making clamshell containers for hamburgers, plastic cutlery, plastic bowls and utensils and so forth. At the time, we were feted as being an environmentally sensitive company because we were replacing wax paper and wooden pulp and things that were far more environmentally destructive. Today, we don't produce we don't produce any plastics. We don't produce any polyethylene, polystyrene, or anything. We're producing the raw materials for Boeing. Every Boeing 787 has 21 tons of our products on a per plane basis. We're one of the largest manufacturers in the world that are making the chemical components that are going to electronic vehicles and batteries, wind blades, solar panels, building insulations, and so forth. So you just go on and on. It's a vast world of chemistry. You do not advance civilization. You do not conserve energy today without our products and without our industry.
So Peter, what you described is a very diverse business line. I mean, everything from basic building block chemicals to high performance products and materials. But they all share a need for affordable and reliable energy, namely natural gas, both to run the operations, but also the feedstock source for your products. Of course, energy prices had quite a ride through the pandemic. And over the last year or so, we saw demand outpace supply around the world as lockdowns were lifted, making energy more expensive, especially in Europe and Asia. That was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has only exacerbated those tight markets. So how have those price spikes impacted your global operations?
That's a very good question. We're seeing changes today, Marty, that we have not seen in decades. The changes I'm talking about, we used to price our products on a quarterly basis. It was unusual. It was not unusual to have prices in our industry that would be locked in for 3, 6, even 12 months at a time. We, in the last year, went from quarterly pricing to monthly pricing to weekly pricing, and now for the first time, literally in our industry's history, at least the products, particularly in Europe and in Asia, we're moving prices on a daily basis. Now, what this means is that when you look at this on a consumer point of view, stability in pricing, whether it be fertilizers, which is a raw material for the entire food industry, or you look at our insulation materials, which is the raw material for the entire cold chain process, getting food from the field freshly to the grocery store and so forth. That means these prices are going to be fluctuating and changing, I dare say, almost on a daily basis or weekly basis, because we've seen such massive movement in volatility. Let me just give you one number alone, just natural gas in Europe this last year. Natural gas in Europe started off the year at about $5 per MMBTU. That's equivalent to about $30 gas, or excuse me, $30 crude oil. So energy, $30 crude. In the last couple of weeks, we have seen it spike as high as $35 per MMBTU. That's the equivalency of over $300 a barrel crude oil. So imagine crude oil going upwards as high as $300 a barrel, crashing back down to $100 a barrel, up to $150 a barrel. And then you see intraday spikes where the price go as high as $450 a barrel. That means your price out on the gas pump would be fluctuating between $15 and $20 a gallon. That's what we're seeing in these volatile energy markets around the world. And so, so customers or suppliers like us that stand between the raw materials and the consumer, we have to push these products pricing through in faster ways than we've ever done in our history, because we've never seen volatility like this.
It's fascinating. So let's stick to the energy cost for a minute. I mean, you of course have had a front row seat to the U.S. Energy picture. 15 years ago we saw high natural gas prices. Shale revolution ends up bringing costs down quite a bit, and chemical industry itself ended up putting a lot of capital into U.S. facilities. So now, as the largest producer of both natural gas and oil, the U.S. has been increasingly able to export supplies while still meeting our domestic needs. So let me first ask, whether the fact that we are now a net exporter of natural gas has affected your U.S. operations.
Well, when fracking hit the United States about 12 years ago, our industry invested over $150 billion into chemical expansions, chemical operations. These are engineering jobs, manufacturing jobs, trucking jobs, and these are not minimum wage retail jobs. These are the bread and butter of communities and cities. So competitive raw material pricing, competitive energy is hugely important to the millions of jobs, be it truckers, railroaders, manufacturers, engineers, scientists, and so forth, dependent on the world of chemistry. So hugely important. The problem I see now is that while the U.S. is balanced, on one hand, we're restricting production, we're restricting pipelines, we're making it overly complicated to drill, to build pipelines, to build infrastructure, to invest in that needed infrastructure. We can all talk about net zero economies and all this other stuff. It is nonsense to think that we're going to be anywhere close to that in the next couple of years. We have to get real as to where we are today. So we're restricting supply of energy and natural gas. On the other hand, we're talking about exporting 15 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe to supplant the 150 billion cubic meters that Russia's presently bringing into Europe. And as we ship that product from the US, which are still realistically years away from doing because we don't have the capabilities to do so today, we're going to see US prices go up because of that. So I have no problem with us exporting gas, but let's make sure that we are doing an adequate job, and we're not doing this today, of making sure that we're building out the infrastructure to be able to produce and to move that natural gas, which is replacing coal, which is why the United States is cutting its CO2 in the last 10 years more than the next 10 countries combined.
Well, let's build on that thought, because I think it's an important point about the role that natural gas is going to play in the energy transition and decarbonization, around the world. So, as a company that operates on 6 continents, and you're a big consumer of energy as well. So, I mean, I guess let's just expand on your view of America's role in helping deliver those, new supplies of natural gas and oil, to allies and partners around the world. And as you pointed out, this is especially important when we're going to see with the sanctions on Russia that have taken and will take off of the market, supplies from one of the world's largest energy producers and exporters.
Marty, I have really mixed emotions in this. I got to be honest with you, because our company is about 35, almost 40% North America, about 30% European, and about 30% Asian, mostly China. Europe has almost the equivalence, and in some areas it has even greater opportunity for fracking than the United States does. So fracking is not just a US phenomenon. If Europe wanted to do it, if Europe wanted to transition out of coal and not be dependent on Russia, and to replace that coal with natural gas as they then transition to wind and nuclear and other areas that are even yet greener, they have those capabilities of doing so. But if they're going to forego that opportunity and become reliant on Russia, become reliant on the US, that's up to the Europeans, but they shouldn't do it at the competitiveness, and we shouldn't be exporting our energy resources at the competitiveness of our own manufacturers. We ought to be exporting cars instead of exporting the raw materials for metal and exporting energies. We ought to be looking to how we upvalue our energy assets in this country rather than just exporting them at the lowest possible cost.
That gets back a bit to the point you made earlier about if we're actually built out the infrastructure that we need, then that does provide more of an opportunity to facilitate exporting some of our energy resources as we continue to do that. But let me change the topic a bit, and as we focus on the energy transition, efforts to decarbonize the economy, and frankly the ambitious goals that we all share to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we know we're going to need to build massive amounts of infrastructure and build it quickly. Now, Huntsman's built a lot of facilities in the U.S., so I'm wondering if I could ask you to describe describe how you look at the permitting process here in the U.S. and frankly, do you think it's consistent with the massive infrastructure build out that's needed to meet those ambitions?
No, it's nowhere close. I mean, we need to have, I feel like we're having a Marshall Plan to some degree on funding of the build out. We also need to have a Marshall Plan that's going to review the layers and layers of regulatory approvals, a Marshall Plan that's going to go through and figure out what is most needed on that approval process and clean out. A lot of these processes, we have to understand, listeners have to understand, they just build on previous years. So as we add, we don't subtract anything. And in many areas, we have environmental regulations that date back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. The EPA was created by Nixon in the 1970s. And we just keep getting more and more layers and layers and layers. We have EPA regulators, and we have a lot of other regulators outside the EPA that don't even know the federal laws. It literally takes weeks to be able to interpret regulations as to where we ought to be going. So it's great that we're putting aside all this money and we're talking about building cars and building the supply chain and building the energy raw materials for electric batteries and so forth. We are the only North American producer that produces a pure carbonate. Now, pure carbonate is a raw material, goes into electrolytes. Electrolytes go into the manufacturing of EV batteries. We hear about all these EV batteries we want to onshore into North America. It takes us 9 to 10 months to build new capacities for electrolytes. It takes us almost 2 years to get the permits to be able to build that out. So it takes us longer to get the permits by a factor of 2, almost 3, than it does for us to be able to build out the facilities themselves. And they're talking about adding more regulations that may even take that permitting process upwards of 3+ years. So when we think about this regulation, we think about wanting to build out the infrastructure. We think about wanting to deliver cheap and affordable energy to people in New England, and we have pipelines that take 20 years to build over the Appalachians that ought to be taking us 6 months to build. That's where regulation doesn't just become a regulation. It just becomes a killer for these sort of advancements.
No, I think it's a critical point. As I said, we've got shared goals and shared ambitions on what we want to achieve from clean energy and infrastructure and just addressing the supply chain. But yeah, the regulations and permitting have got to follow along with that. Well, Peter, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank you again for joining us. And I really look forward to continuing this dialogue. So again, thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Great talking to you, Marty.
Hello, I'm John Murphy. I'm Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She's well known to this audience. Dr. Ngozi is the 7th Director General of the World Trade Organization. She took office on March 1st last year, becoming the first African to serve as Director General. She's also the first U.S. citizen to serve in the role, so we're happy to claim her a little bit as well. Earlier, she served twice as Nigeria's finance minister, and she had a 25-year career at the World Bank as an economist, rising to the organization's #2 position. She more recently served as chair of the board of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Dr. Ngozi, welcome.
Thank you, John.
Before we turn to the World Trade Organization, let's talk about world trade just for a moment. It seems like we open the newspapers every day and see columns written about how globalization is dead. And yet international trade flows just seem to grow and grow. And nonetheless, it's clear that international trade is under stress. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has interrupted a great deal of trade in agricultural products, metals, energy. And also before that invasion, there was a great deal of stress between the US and China and talk about decoupling. So welcome your sense of this. What is the trajectory of world trade today?
Well, thank you, John. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that there's now, heightened talk about the trajectory of world trade, going into 2 or 3 blocks, a fractured and fragmented trade system, the coupling, as you mentioned, and the skepticism about globalization. That had actually started even before the pandemic. People had started talking about deglobalization. I think the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have just accelerated and heightened this feeling that the multilateral trading system and multilateralism as a whole is in trouble and can no longer deliver. However, there's also what you said, which is that if you look at the actual numbers of trade flows, you will see that what's happening on the ground doesn't speak to, the multilateral trading system not working. If you just look at the flows between China and the US, which is, with where the rhetoric and the tension is fraught. You have US exports, I think last year to China were at about $153 billion. And China's exports to the US were maybe 4 times that. So I'm getting to the peak where they were the year before. So the actual trade going on between countries is quite robust and does not sometimes match with the rhetoric. So that's the first point I want to make, that business people, consumers seem to be doing something somewhat different from what politicians are saying. I think the second point I'd like to make is that we should be very careful. Yes, globalization it's lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. It's brought prosperity over time. But we know that there are people who have been left behind. Poor people within rich countries and poor countries who did not benefit. That being said, I don't think this is the time to now talk about fragmentation and walking away. Actually, I think this is the time to invest in the multilateral trading system. As I've termed it, it's a global public good that was born 77 years ago, nurtured over time. It has delivered, it has problems. Let's invest in it and make it better, not walking away. The third and last point I'll make on this issue is that WTO economists have actually looked at what it would cost if the world were to break into 2 trading blocks. And they found that, longer term real GDP would decline by about 5% if this were to happen. So there are costs to fragmentation. There are costs to blocks, and we should not minimize those, and we should really reflect.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'll just add the U.S. Chamber commissioned a study of what decoupling would cost as well, and also came up with some very large and alarming numbers. So thank you for that. I wonder if we could touch on supply chains, which is something that most people never talked about until recent years, but now it seems that we talk about it over the dinner table. It seems that we're at an inflection point with supply chain problems that in much of the world, the problem was a huge surge in demand, which caused trade to grow much more than anticipated and left our ports clogged. And now, though, in 2022, we have supply side interruptions. So we're going perhaps from a demand problem to a supply side problem where grain can't get out of Russia and Ukraine, or the COVID lockdowns in China may be interrupting this. What does the WTO have to offer when it comes to the supply chain issue?
Well, I think, 2 things. We tried to understand a little bit better, because one of the questions we get from different kinds of the financial sector, for instance, central bank governors who are worried about whether this is a structural problem and will continue to cause inflationary pressures from different business groups is this going to last very long? Are we going to see the end of this? And initially, when it was a supply-demand mismatch, particularly with respect to what is happening in the United States and the fiscal stimulus that was given during the pandemic, which led to the overwhelming demand, we thought maybe this will, phase out once supply comes back into stream, and once the effect of the fiscal stimulus goes down, demand will go down. And some of that actually began to happen before the war in Russia came in. But at the same time, we started asking ourselves, we're getting all these questions, maybe we better try and understand whether there are other issues, structural issues that may be lying behind this, that may mean things may not work out quite as quickly as we thought. And we did have about a month ago a supply chain conference where we brought logistics port operators, we brought businesses like IKEA, we brought small and medium enterprises, we brought shipping companies, Maersk, CMC, CMG, the big guys. And we wanted to understand from them. And what we understood really is that there are some difficult problems that need to be solved if supply chains are to work themselves out. So quite apart from the COVID and the 500 ships in a line in Shanghai, who cannot offload, and the lockdowns from the pandemic, you've got issues of labor, for instance. Now, that seems to be easing a little bit, but there were a lot of complaints from shipping companies and logistics operators that we get our goods there and then there are no trucks, no truck drivers to drive trucks. We don't even know whether they'll be there, so we end up, waiting. Warehouse space, they complained this wasn't sufficient. Even some of the port operators said airports needed work in order to fit with the new kinds of ships that are being built. So there's some of these logistical and structural problems that will need a little bit of time to work out, and they still kind of affects the way that supply chain logistics work. And then you've got the war in Ukraine, and you've got what that has done to the Black Sea and the blockage there. So you just have a piling on of some of these issues. And I think it will take us some time to be able to work that out. Now, specifically, what has the WTO been doing? Apart from understanding and trying to work with these companies on what we can do to help them, we've worked with specific sectors or industries like vaccine manufacturers who are experiencing supply chain issues. Some of them have to come from export restrictions and prohibitions that stop them getting their inputs to where they need them for production. Some of them are restrictions on outputs. And we've been meeting with the CEOs every 6 weeks, looking at their supply chain problems, at their raw materials problems, and trying to work with our members to make sure that these restrictions are lifted, for instance, and that they don't form an impediment. And that has worked really well. We've gone from 119 export restrictions at the beginning of the pandemic down to about 35 a few weeks ago. And then we have trade facilitation measures. We have the trade facilitation agreement, and getting our members to work more on facilitating trade, implementing this agreement is really very popular with business. So on those two ends, we've also been working to make sure supply chains are assisted as much as possible.
Well, thank you for that work. In particular, the work on export restrictions, I think, is something the business community really values, whether it's with vaccine inputs or today in agricultural products, where the spread of export restrictions can greatly exacerbate the problem of global hunger. Changing topics a bit here, I wanted to raise the TRIPS waiver debate, this idea that suspending intellectual property protections for vaccines might help their production. And Dr. Ngozi, as you know, we at the U.S. Chamber don't think that that's a good idea. We're quite convinced that intellectual property protections have actually accelerated the creation of these vaccines. We've had something like 12 billion doses administered. There's another 9 billion expected. And many countries around the world seem to be swimming in vaccine doses that are not being used. I wonder if you could share your thoughts at this moment in time, not relitigating the entire issue, but isn't there a growing sense that this is an idea? The idea of a TRIPS waiver is an idea whose time has passed, given this very widespread availability of vaccines today?
Well, thank you, John. You raised some very important issues. Let me say right off the bat that I also believe that we need to incentivize research and development, and that we must make sure that whatever we do does not disincentivize that. I strongly believe in that from my work in Gavi and so on. So that's a very important point. At the same point, you say, maybe this is now passé because we have a surplus or a strong production of vaccines now, and that is the truth. Let me just take that in two ways. One, it is good we now have that, but it's come a little bit too late for the members who were insisting on this. Expand a little bit on that, John. We went through this inequity of access period where people in poor countries were really waiting for these vaccines and felt themselves to be at the back of the queue. And it was an unfortunate period when richer countries bought up the available vaccines and the poorer countries didn't get. We pushed a lot to increase production, but it's coming at a time after waiting that people have become a bit skeptical, a bit resistant. So we have to work really hard with campaigns in order to get those jabs in arms and with distribution problems. So you're right, now we have a surplus production and we have some distribution problems and some vaccine hesitancy and apathy. All that needs work. Because if you look at it, even in Africa, it's a fraction of people vaccinated, maybe up to 20% compared to 18% in some developed countries. So we need to work. But the problem is that this came a little bit late. When and by then, policymakers and politicians in these countries had been caught without able to give service to their populations. And I think what you're seeing is this won't happen to us again. We won't be caught with our pants down, quote unquote, the next time. Just as policymakers and politicians in rich countries bought more than what their population needed, just so they would not be accused of not being ready or having enough. Now you see policymakers in those poor countries saying, no, we are going to insist on having a way to have access, so that next time around, or if this wave continues, we can manufacture. And you know that the concentration of manufacturing is quite intense. 10 countries export 80% of the vaccines in the world. So all these things are on the table. Now, we still have those 100 and something countries at the WTO insisting on a TRIPS waiver, just as we have those, including those who have strong business and pharma manufacturing, insisting this is not the case, we should not have the waiver. To try and break this impasse, because those 100 and something members are not going away, we try to find a medium ground, a compromise, working with 4 countries who said, okay, we'll agree to have discussions with each other informally to see if we can come up with some ideas. And what they have come up with is within the framework of the TRIPS agreement. So it's not something outside the framework. So it does give some protections, but at the same time allows access so that developing countries will be able, to have that access to manufacture without, in my belief, if you look at the agreement strongly, without disincentivizing research and production. So this is, of course, the nature of a compromise is that both sides, neither of them really like it. The business community and the countries where they work would like to have nothing done. The TRIPS waiver people feel this is not what we were asking for. So I think both should really look at it and see that this is a reasonable, workable compromise for both sides. That's what I think. And we're debating it now at the WTO. We'll see if members can finally come up with that workable solution.
Well, thank you. I think that there is a sense in the business community that there's a willingness to support this issue of equity and make additional investments in distribution and getting shots into arms. And that's something where I think governments around the world, developing governments, the United States and others, really could have done more and can still do more. So we'll stay engaged on that. One last question for you. Of course, we're just a month out from MC12, from the ministerial conference. What's your sense of what can be accomplished here? I know there's talks on many fronts. We've followed, for just to give one example, the fishery subsidy negotiations. It's very frustrating. This has gone on for years. That's an example of an area where an agreement could accomplish a great deal to prevent overfishing around the world. What's your sense of what can be accomplished?
Well, John, let me say one thing. I share your frustration at the length of time it takes. It shouldn't take this long to negotiate agreements. Fisheries, agriculture, they've taken more than 20 years. So we were quite hopeful coming into the ministerial in November. If you recall, we were going to hold it in November until Omicron came out and we had to postpone. Then we were hopeful of being able to deliver several things. Now the war in Ukraine has had an impact. And it's happening in other multilateral fora, where it's a little bit difficult for those countries who are against it, saying that it's difficult for them to work or be in the room with maybe the delegation of Russia and so on. And now we negotiate. So if that's the case, negotiating may not be easy. So how do we deal with that to make sure we still have some sensible deliverables at FC12? We are trying to work hard before. I'm saying to our members, and so is the General Council Chair, that we need to work hard now, because if the ministers cannot negotiate, let's take that as the worst case scenario. We don't want to wait until we get to MC12 and then find out they can't complete the package. So the strategy is to try to work on food security issues now. We hope to have something on that. Response to the pandemic, we just spoke a little bit about that, including issues of transparency and export restrictions. Fisheries, to work on that. And agriculture to at least advance the negotiations, even if we can't close it. So that's a bit the approach, to try and have one or two deliverables that we finish so that ministers can bless, and then to put the others in a way that we can advance the work and agree on a work program that can then be completed at MC13. So we're still looking for one or two deliverables. It won't be as robust as it was going to be in November, given the situation we have, but we still want to come out of it with a couple of concrete things achieved.
Well, Dr. Ngozi, the U.S. business community wants you to succeed, and we want to be helpful to you in every way that we can. We need the WTO. We need the WTO to succeed and to deliver new agreements. We're also strong supporters of reform that would allow the appellate body to be restored. So there's a lot more we could cover, but I want to thank you for joining us here today and wish you every success here in the next month.
Thank you, John. Just before we close, I do want to say one quick word on WTO reform. You said that the business community is very interested in that. It's very timely, and I hope we get your support. We hope to agree on a process to implement the reforms at MC12, especially with respect to the appellate body and the dispute settlement system. And I'm happy to say that the US is engaging other members now to talk about this. So we're hopeful. The WTO process is sometimes as important as substance. So we need to agree a process, and I think we can do that. Thanks very much, John. And thank you for the support of the US business community.
Well, thank you. That's good news. And we'll stay in close touch. All the best.
You. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
What an informative conversation that was. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi. Thank you, John, for giving us a very timely look at the WTO's agenda amidst a very challenging trade landscape. I'm Neil Harrington, Senior Vice President of the Americas here at the US Chamber, and I'm pleased to turn the conversation to the 9th Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, where the Biden administration will be welcoming governments from across the region just next month. For those joining us from other parts of the world who may not be familiar with the Summit of the Americas, imagine a UN General Assembly style meeting in which leaders of the hemisphere meet with stakeholders from across the region to discuss economic, social, and political challenges and opportunities to confront jointly. The Chamber is proud to be working with the State Department and the Biden administration to organize the 4th CEO Summit of the Americas, the official private stakeholder event associated with the summit. Simply put, we believe the upcoming summit represents the best opportunity our region has had in years to build public and private consensus around urgently needed resilience and prosperity in the Western Hemisphere. To get more insight on the summit and the US government's priorities in Los Angeles, I'm very pleased to now be joined by former Congresswoman Debbie Murkazal-Powell, who was recently named by President Biden as a special advisor for the summit. Special Advisor Murkazal-Powell is uniquely qualified for this critical role, having served the people of Florida's 26th district with distinction, and is as the first ever member of Congress to be born in South America. She hails from the beautiful country of Ecuador. And among her many accomplishments in service to her constituents, Congresswoman Murkazal-Powell prioritized issues of importance to our region, including spearheading finalization of temporary protected status for Venezuelans who were fleeing tyranny and economic deprivation in their home country. A key priority for Special Advisor Murkazal-Powell, a native speaker of both English and Spanish, is connecting with our country's great diaspora communities from Latin America and the Caribbean to ensure they are fully vested in the summit and in its aftermath. Special Advisor Murkazal-Powell, we're so appreciative you could take time out of your very busy schedule to join us today. And we're looking forward to your thoughts about the administration's plans and goals for the 9th Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Neil, for having me on with you today. And I wanted to say a special thanks to the US Chamber of Commerce for hosting the CEO Summit in Los Angeles in June. It's really a great opportunity to bring all the different stakeholders together in just a few weeks. I can tell you that right now, as we have been living such a critical moment in watching what has been going on in the Russian attack against Ukraine, one of the main components, and it has been since 1994 of the Summit of the Americas, is democratic governance. That has been a critical and main issue that the countries of the region have focused on. Back in 2001, all the countries in the region except for Cuba signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which really shows a commitment from all the different governments in the region on protecting democratic institutions, protecting the rule of law, fair and free elections, and ensuring that there's a protection of human rights. And so I think that this is a critical moment for us to be in a great opportunity to host the summit here in the United States. Like you said, we haven't hosted the summit since 1994 when we had it in Miami. The last summit was in 2018 in Peru. And this summit happens every 2 to 3 years. But President Biden is committed in making sure that we have the most inclusive Summit of the Americas today, which includes having conversations with young Americans, having conversations with civil society, ensuring that we work closely with the private sector, and bringing all of us together to tackle the most difficult challenges that we have in the region. The theme of this year's summit is building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. And what does that mean? It means strengthening democratic governance. It means building a healthcare system that's going to be much stronger after the challenges that we faced with the pandemic. It means dealing with the climate crisis and investing in green energy. And also it provides an opportunity to bridge that digital divide that we've seen in the region. 30% of Americans living here in the continent do not have access to the internet. And this is critical, as you know, for so many young entrepreneurs that want to participate in e-commerce. So I'm extremely excited and honored to be the special advisor for President Biden. I look forward to your participation, which is going to be critical in focusing on all of our priorities, which I just mentioned.
Thank you so much, Special Advisor. I think what is so encouraging to us is how closely your priorities as the Biden administration, as the US government, align closely with ours in the private sector. When you're talking about things like democracy and governance, bridging the digital divide, the green energy transition, there are a lot of synergies here that I think are going to produce a very successful summit. So thinking about this, I wonder if the next question I can ask you is, obviously part of your work and others in the administration is talking to other governments in the region about what commitments maybe we can see government to government coming out of the summit. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, one of the things that we have all agreed upon is that the summit is a launching pad to form these alliances, strengthening our ties to all the different heads of government and putting together a plan for implementation. We are very much committed in ensuring that we work closely with the entire region as we put together a plan of implementation. The governments, what they're looking for more than anything is knowing that we are strong allies, that we are working together, that we are working regionally so that we can actually tackle these cracks that the pandemic has left behind, including the economic crisis that many of these countries have faced. So I think that one of the things that we have been discussing is how do we create better opportunities for financing? It doesn't mean putting more money in, it means being innovative and providing long-term financing at lower interest rates, for example, or making sure that we bring private sector companies and we build that connectivity so that companies know that they can invest in manufacturing in Guatemala or in mining in Ecuador. And putting all of these connections together are going to really prove pivotal for our alliances in the region, but also for economic growth here in the United States as well. I can tell you that there are many companies that I've talked to that represent different areas of the private sector that are just ready to have that information so that they can actually work with different countries in the region so that that will provide growth here, but also in the hemisphere.
No, that's terrific. And I think you talked at the outset about how this is going to be the most inclusive summit in history. And that's certainly the perspective we're taking as the private sector when we get small and medium-sized enterprises to the table, diversity with women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and ensuring that they're integrated into value and trade supply chains. I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those important commitments that you have with governments. Talk about how we as the private sector can collaborate with the administration and other governments in ensuring that we're driving consensus on some of these key issues that you mentioned, whether it's governance, whether it's bridging the digital divide, the green energy transition, and beyond.
I think it's extremely important, and you play a key role in providing the information to a lot of these governments as we talk about strengthening democratic governance, that part of what we need to show is that democracy delivers for every citizen, whether you live here in rural America or you're living in certain areas of Peru, that we need to build an equitable future, like you said, where we can provide economic opportunities for women-owned businesses, where we can actually bring communities that have been marginalized, especially after the pandemic, into the fold where they can participate. I mean, there's a lot, part of the problem that we have seen here and in other countries in the region is that the income inequality has really brought upon a rise in misinformation. People have been much more susceptible in believing what they're being told because there's a lot of apathy, there's a lot of resentment. That's why building upon the democratic institutions, strengthening democratic governance with the help of the private sector, explaining that, because businesses want to invest in countries where they're free of corruption, where they're protecting human rights, where there's transparency, where there's opportunity to have a strong labor market in those countries. I think that you're going to play a pivotal role in that. And that's why I'm so excited to have the Chamber sponsor the CEO Summit, have your participation, and have me on today so that we can get more people to participate in the summit in June, but also in the implementation process.
Thank you so much, Special Advisor. That's really well said. I think for us, you talked about another important theme as to how we drive this into the future and ensure that, for us, and I know for you and the administration, we're focused on really making this much more than a single event, right? And we really want to establish a sequence for interaction, a sequence for public-private consensus and building, and all of these different kind of pillars and areas of focus we've talked about. Can you talk a little bit about what the administration has planned for the subsequent couple years when you will still retain ownership of the summit process until you hand it over to the next host?
Yeah, I think that that's all under discussion right now, but I can tell you that there's a lot of excitement building from civil society and also the private sector on possibly hosting other conferences or forums where we can actually talk about how we can, talk more about details on how we can electrify the roads and highways of not only the United States of America, but also of those countries in the Caribbean or in the Galapagos, for example. There are a lot of financial institutions that are providing financing for clean energy and resilient structures, which is what's highly needed in coastal communities, but particularly in the Caribbean. I know that part of the summit is having a plan moving forward. There's conversations of having NGOs participating and hosting different conversations on this, but also, for example, I spoke with the president of the Bank for Development for Latin America. And one of the things that he has been mentioning, and which is a very interesting idea, is bringing together the mayors of cities all over the hemisphere, because a lot of those changes happen locally. How do we get them involved? So I can assure you that the summit is just going to be the launching pad. It's the beginning of a great 2 years of really building this better future for our children and for everyone living in the region.
I love that point you ended on, because I think it's easy for a lot of us to forget that everything really happens at the subnational level. So I think that is a terrific endeavor to involve mayors, governors, heads of provinces, et cetera, around our region. I think that absolutely is the way that long-term success is built from the grassroots up. You've been extremely generous with your time, so I want to let you go, but I want to let you have the final word. Any concluding thoughts for the viewers of the Global Forum about the 9th Summit of the Americas?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that this is the most important event that President Biden is hosting here in the United States. And it's one of his main priorities to make sure that we are strengthening our alliances, building a better future for all of us. I would love to have all of you follow us on the Summit of the Americas page on our LinkedIn page, where we're going to be posting a lot of different events where you can participate. We're going to have watch parties. If you can't participate in person in the summit in June, you can participate online. Please follow us, give us your feedback. That's what the summit is about, and that's our main focus. And thank you so much for being a part of this. And I hope that we hear from you. That's the most important part.
Special Advisor Mukartab Pal, thank you so much for your time and especially your service in this really, really important endeavor. Really looking forward to seeing you in person in Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Neil. See you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for the U.S. Chamber's second annual Global Forum. I'm Scott Eisner, President of the U.S. Africa Business Center and Senior Vice President here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Over the past 2 days, you've heard from leaders at the top levels of business and government. They've shared their views on some of the most important issues of our time, from international trade to digitization to sustainability and energy security. We've learned that despite the world's challenges, the possibilities for the future are great. Through innovation, competition, and leadership, the private sector will help drive us to a brighter tomorrow. Thank you to our partners, Bayer, FedEx, Sempra, and UPS for joining us in this year's Global Forum. We invite you to continue the conversation with us next month. As you heard, the U.S. Chamber will host the 4th CEO Forum as part of the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. Tune into the webcast for conversations with diverse business leaders from the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere to drive innovative, practical solutions for a brighter future across the Americas. We'll see you in June, and thanks again for joining us today.